To the computer. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Satsang. It's a beautiful day. It's in Hawaii. We are having winds off of the coast, and it's just as beautiful as it possibly can be. So I'm hoping everybody's having the same thing go on. So today, I wanted just to start out. I've got some really nice questions that Donovan sent over, so I'm going to work with those in a minute. And then, but I wanted to just start off and talk a bit about the platform that we are creating, so that understanding can in essence, begin to happen. I was talking actually to Ron today, and I'm going to mute you guys down here if everybody doesn't care. But I was talking to Ron today, and we were talking a little bit about the experience of, as you move into these different arisings, as it were, that sense that it's kind of new and you don't know what to do with it, and all of that. And a lot of times people think, oh, it's my intellectual capacity. And what it really is, it's the platform upon which we're actually speaking from. And so the pointers I'm working with all the time are always pointing away from the separate individual who thinks that they autonomously do something, and towards a world where you and everything else arises in exactly the same moment. And those two, the first one is the living understanding that we've learned for the entirety of our life. So our platform for understanding anything egoic is really, it's really established over years and years and years. So when somebody says something to you that's egoic in nature, it's really easy to find a place for that. Donald Trump jumped out of an airplane today in a parachute. Well, you know what to do with that, right? It's like we're speaking about that. But when we start to point to consciousness itself and the living understanding that arises when everything is experienced not from an egoic standpoint, as though I'm in the middle of it and it's happening to me, then that's a new place. And we haven't had a lot of conditioning. We haven't had a lot of experience with that new and particular place. And one of the stories I like to tell is the old Buddhist story about the Buddha was in his ashram, and he wrote a koan out on the wall, and one of the people came out, like the chief priest, and he wrote an answer, and then another one of the more middle level priests came out and wrote an answer, and towards the end of the day, the cook came out of the kitchen and he wrote the answer. And so the next day, Buddha came by the wall and he saw these answers, and he stops just dead in his tracks when he saw the answer that the cook had written. And of course, nobody knew who wrote these things. And he says, oh my goodness. He says, wow, here it is. And someone behind him immediately said, you know what they said, right? You know what the question is. Who wrote that one? Now think about that for a minute. In the egoic mind, what's the first thing we ask? Who did it? That's the first question we always ask. And Buddha very slowly turned around and he said, if I told you that my chief priest wrote it, he said, you'd think really, really highly of it. And he says, if I told you that one of the middle, chiefs wrote it, priests wrote it, he said, you think, maybe could be. And he says, if I told you that the kitchen help wrote it, he said, you'd immediately write it off. He says, but here's my suggestion. Read it and see what it says. And so when we're dealing with pointers to a new place of being, it's more about what we're pointing to and not who's pointing. And so that's part of the expansion of what we're talking about. That's part of what happens to us all, is this new place and this new platform that we have. So we live in a world of separation. And so we think in terms of separation, we explain things in terms of separation. That's all there. So when you talk about awakening and you say, oh, that is a permanent platform or place of peace, it's simply because in that place there's no separation. That's all. Permanent peace is always existent when there's no separation. So when we spend a lot of time talking about the psychology of individuals, guess what? There's fear. Why is there fear? Well, there's only something to fear when you're separate from something else, right? That's because how could anything that's not separate be afraid? There's only one thing. Afraid of what? And yet when you're separate, then you have fear. So when you look at all of the emotions and all of how we interpret the psychology of a human being, they're entirely based on the notion that we are a separate, autonomous actor in our own drama. That's the place that's being lived from. And then the experience of that living, it includes all of those particular notions and feelings. Our feelings organized around believing that we're separate. Our beliefs organized around believing that we're separate. So believing that we're separate becomes the basis on which we see life. And when we're working in here, we're actually pointing to somewhere that is a different place. It doesn't include the notion of separateness. And in fact, the experience is that the actual perception of the experience is from a place of not being separate. So that becomes what we're speaking of. Now remember, when I talk about it, I've already created a concept or a notion. So I'm pointing towards an experience. So the idea that anybody could listen to me or anybody else and then have something as a result is really a misplaced notion. All that you would have, well, if you listen to me particularly, you would have a whole bunch of disjointed stories adding up to nothing. Now you could listen to Buddha or Nisargadatta and some of those folks, and they probably in their elegant intellect would be describing something that you could carry away, but it wouldn't do you any good. It would do absolutely no good. The experience of how perceiving happens and when we point to it and how that then works on you. So when I was speaking to Ron today, Ron said, oh my goodness, he says, my experience is shifting. And when I hear that, then I say, oh, that's exactly as it should be. The way that experience is perceived will shift if you simply look to your experience. And all I'm doing, and what anybody who does what I do, is they're looking for the little assumptions that you hold that you probably long ago forgotten that you even hold them. Like the way that we look at everything separately. I see something written on a wall, who wrote it? First question we ask. I see a quote on Facebook, what newspaper, what source did it come from? I don't read the quote, I want to know where it came from. So we're just so used to doing that's our default place. Well, the default place, if you can look at that and you hear somebody go, well, take a look at what we're doing, and you say, well, that's kind of silly that we do that. That's exactly it. Because what that does is it brings it into your noticing, and then it allows it to dissolve, and maybe the next time you look at it differently. And now a new experience occurs. If the first thing that you don't say is where did it come from, but you say, wait, I remember I always ask where it come from. I'm going to actually see what it says. You've made a step. The experience of that moment is going to be entirely different. And so all of the work that we're doing here, and when we're on the spiritual path, you're going to see, people like who speak like I do. They're trying to dissolve your incredibly, permanently held ideas that are working inside of you that you don't even notice are there anymore. Now, what will happen is as you go along, I always tell people, I found a wonderful thing to do when you're in a satsang is when you hear the questions, answer them for yourselves, because it's kind of fun. Because what happens is you start to actually answer them in a different way than you might have the first time around. So that's always a really, fun exercise, is to go, oh, wait a minute, because in the speeded up world that you live in, the chances of you unraveling something are a little bit tougher because of the speed of life itself. But here in our little space here, this is a perfect place when you hear a question, see what your answer looks like. A lot of times your answer and my answer will be exactly the same. It's just they'll be differing words, right? And in a way, what you're doing is you're now in a way using pointers on yourself, because by answering the question, you're busting open your own assumptions. So that's an activity that you're just in the middle of, and this is particularly set up to do exactly that. And so remember, we look at the world from a separate place. We're used to doing that. We ask all of our questions from a separate place. We see the world from that place. We organize it that way. This is, in essence, a step away from that and into a different living understanding about how life arises. And here's the other thing: don't worry about losing what you already have. That's what a lot of people go, wait a minute, Alan, I've got it all figured out. Even though it's wrong, I got it figured out. Will I lose that? And I'm here to tell you that the way that you have thought for the last 20, 30, 40, or 50 years, I'm 67, so it's probably 65 of those years I've been thinking. If you actually onboard something new and that old stuff doesn't stick around, please send me an email immediately. You are the rarest thing ever found, because that 62 years or 65 years of learning, it doesn't go away. It hangs in there really tight. Stepping into a new place, the old loop will play and you'll see it and you'll go, oh, well, there it is. I get it. So don't worry. Nobody takes anything away from anybody here. You get to keep your cherished belief system, even if all it is kind of a wild guess. You get to keep it. No one's going to take that away from you. And calling assumptions on yourself doesn't change that. I remember the Santa Claus story at 67, even though I probably gave it up at age 10. So I can still recite Santa Claus if anybody would like to hear it. So it's in there somewhere. So don't worry about it. And I know that sounds funny, but the mind will come in and say that, holy cow, how am I going to function? If I'm in this place where everything arises all at one time, how am I going to function? Trust me, you'll function. It'll happen just fine. You don't have to worry about that. So there's a little lighthearted add-on to the notion that the world as we see it, that world of separation guides how we ask questions, how we answer questions, and it limits, if you will, where it is that we can go. And the spiritual journey is just an internal noticing or an internal messaging that says something is wrong here. So if you are not living to the fullest sense of who you are as consciousness, that alarm system or that messaging or that noticing is going to be there. It just is. It's going to be there. So now some people will override it and stop noticing it after, because people will say, well, wait a minute, Alan, not everybody follows a spiritual path. But those who maintain a sensitivity to feeling that there's a miscorrespondence internally, that where they are and where it is that life is taking them, they feel that rub. And you can get to that with just about any spiritual seeker. If you ask them their questions, they're going to go, the reason I'm doing this is I know there's somewhere to go. I don't know what it is. I don't know where it is, and I don't know how it looks, but I know there's something happening here. So So that spiritual seeking, you'll always have that noticing inside. Why is there permanent peace? Well, that non-matching part goes away. Consciousness and you just simply unite in one place. The story that you are, the Donovan story, the Carolyn story, the Satyan story, the Allen story, those continue. Nothing happens there. It's just that there is an absolute sense of permanent peace when consciousness itself is recognized in the living understanding, and it drives all of the emergence of your life. So that's what the spiritual journey is, and that's where I kind of like to start. One of the things I'm going to do is, as we go along, I'm going to launch into Dono's questions, because he had some really nice questions he sent over before this. If you want to jump in and chat with me, Dono, or if anybody else has a question that relates, just put it in the chat box, and I'll do it as an add-on. So the first question, one of my favorites that Donovan asked is does one need a guru? So, and this is actually a really great question, and where it comes from is, for those that have followed the Eastern version, and particularly in the country of India, you're going to find that for thousands of years, and Buddha certainly was a guru, and he was around 500 BC. So there's 2,500 years we know of, and we can even go back into the Hindu history and find out that it was even longer. But we know that the path of the spiritual journey, the kind that we're on, when we know that the wholeness, or we know that suffering was a big thing in the Buddhist world. So, and all the suffering is the difference between what's happening and what you want to have happen. That's suffering and misery. That's the kind of suffering Buddha is always talking about. So he was certainly a guru. So we see this model of a guru. And then you have the modern versions, folks doing things like I'm doing, which is a satsang, and for all the world, we look like a guru. So it begs the question. It starts to beg the question. And my answer to that question is no. Don't need a guru. And let me explain why. In the culture of India and in the Eastern traditions, there is a natural way that those cultures live, that the surrendering to another person is seen as an intelligent thing to do. Now, everybody on this particular little satsang today is clearly a Westerner. And I am sure that not one of you has been brought up with the notion that surrendering yourself to another is an intelligent thing to do. I know in my family, nothing was prized higher than independence, and independence to such a degree that it could actually upset the apple cart of the family organization itself. So the culture and the conditioning that we naturally live within, doesn't call for a guru in the way that the East did, which is a surrender to someone else. But there is a surrender, and that is a surrender to the pointers or the notions or the path that we're following. That doesn't repel the Western mind in such a way. And what goes with that is the way that spontaneity is treated in the East. When you go into a spiritual conversation, it starts where it starts and ends where it ends, and you just simply, pick what you need to out of it and place it where it gets placed. In the West, we want an actual platform. So if you look at the work that a lot of the folks that I know, Satyan, for instance, does a thing called an enlightenment intensive. And if you look at what happened, that was Ramana Maharshi's Who Am I coming together with an interpersonal process And so then it migrated to the Western platform as a process. That's exactly how these things happen, because in the West, the process is something that we trust in. In the East, they didn't need a process. They had Ramana Maharshi, who was a guru. So they used the guru model, and we use a model that doesn't include surrendering to another ego. So that in short is the question. But there is a surrender involved, because as long as the ego is not surrendered, it maintains its separateness. So don't think that the activity of having a guru in the East isn't repeated in the West. We just have our way of doing it. And so you'll notice that people don't flock to gurus in the West. And the reason that happens is that it's not in our nature. That's just not a custom or a style we engage in. We do flock to books. We flock to, whatever, but we don't flock to people in that personal surrender manner. So, so that's that. I was just, this is from, I think everybody can read it. I was just reading in the Nisargadatta book that he encouraged his students to also connect with the Sadguru, or the teacher inside yourself. And that is exactly right, Jaya. The Sadguru is always in there. That is consciousness itself. And what happens is the guru is the outside symbol of that internal Sadguru. So if you think of ritual in religious expression, all ritual is an outside occurrence that represents an inside possibility or an inside happening. So that's what ritual does. And guru is a kind of ritual, and the occurrence of the happening is always inside yourself. So that comment is exactly right. Now, who was Nisargadatta talking to? This is a really interesting way to segue into what I was saying. He was, for those who don't know about Nisargadatta, he was born in about 1897, lived in Mumbai, India, had his little business, which was creating what they call beedis, these really foul tasting cigarettes made out of leaves in India. And when I say they're foul tasting, anybody who's ever smoked one and will tell you they are the worst thing in the world, but they're really cheap. And so the poor folks in India buy them and they get used to them. So he made those. That's what he did. That was his business. He lived in the red light district of India. And so to the average Indian, he was a perfect guru. But here's what happened. Nisargadatta got well known, and everybody was flying in from England and Germany and wherever they were coming from. Now, I find some hilarity in the fact that all of these important people had to basically trek into Mumbai, into the red light district, and I've been there. I know where that is. I know right where Nisargadatta's house is. And they would have to climb up 3 flights of stairs. And Nisargadatta smoked these beedis incessantly. And there these luminaries would sit and listen to Nisargadatta in the hot stench of Mumbai while he was smoking beedis, and the smoke was wafting up, and the girls were out on the street. And the only reason I tell that story is to just simply understand that Nisargadatta was beginning to run into a culture where a guru wasn't necessary. And so, and certainly Ramesh Balsekar, who followed him, who went to the London School of Economics and ran the Bank of India, and he passed in 2009. These people were beginning to receive a lot of folks with a Western point of view. And they found themselves having to do what I'm doing only to someone from a different culture, with somebody from a different culture. And that's when you started to see the connection come up, where Nisargadatta would talk about the Sadguru to make sure that the Westerners understood that the guru experience was not one of complete capitulation. It was not one of complete surrender. That was not what was being asked of them. And in the West, even when that happens, and you'll talk to people that have gone through that experience, there's a lot of malfeasance that occurs in those style of relationships. So in my experience, it works a lot better to just recognize where we come from and how strong the conditioning can be around that type of surrender, and understand that the spiritual path is going to emerge in every world and culture in the way that it's going to live there. So I don't see a problem with that. My own story is a complete reflection of that. I went to Osho's ashram after he had left the body. I never knew him personally. As much as I was in love with him, never met him. And then by the time I got to Ramesh, the seeking piece of my life had come to its own end. In fact, Ramesh wanted to know why the heck I was even there. So, and I told him I was there just because I wanted to spend time with him. And he laughed at that and said, "Oh, if that's the only reason, sit down." So that's the that's the nature of I think how it proceeds in the West. So it's a great question, and it's a really nice one to think about from our perspective. So and then the next question that Dono asks, and I think that this is an add-on. Dono, correct me if I'm wrong, because he says, "Does one?" Let me read this. It's a beautiful piece. He says, "Does one need to follow one path, one teaching?" He says, I think at one point when I was suffering heavily, I was looking for an answer to fix things. Now I feel more like I enjoy the seeking and the digging, and I'm learning tools. I've heard people say to stick to one path. I enjoy A Course in Miracles, the Gita, Eckhart Tolle, Osho, Jesus, Alan Watts, etc. I feel more like learning tools for the art of mindful living. So to that, I would say, I absolutely don't think that you need to follow a particular path. I just don't think that's a necessary thing. However, what will likely happen is that how you are and how you do it, when you look back on it, it'll look a little like a path. So when you hear me speak and I basically have all these pointers and I talk in the way I do, most other people don't do it that way. So in a way, I'm laying down, I guess, Alan's path, but it's made up of all those others, because the Course on Miracles, Eckhart Tolle, Osho, Nisargadatta, all of those pieces played into my world and my life as my journey went along. So there is no, in my mind, necessity to follow a particular one person and a particular one thing. The point is, do the pointers dissolve your previously held assumptions? And those assumptions are the ones, as you dig into them, you'll find make you feel like you're in bondage, or as Donald said, I was suffering heavily. That suffering comes from that place. So the dissolution of those assumptions is the place that you want to look. If you follow this particular path, the ones that Donald mentioned all do. Now there are other paths like Amici, who basically hugs people. That's Amici's function in life, and so she's what we call a bhakti. So the wordless engagement of seeing that you and I are not even the same thing has a particular way of transmitting itself. Or Ram Dass and being in service, seva. That's another way to do it. But when you deal with somebody, usually from the West, we're in what we call the Advaita or non-duality space. And all that means is that we use our intellectual concepts as a way to free up or dissolve other intellectual concepts. And when you're done, you throw both of them away. So that's what you always have to be really careful. The concepts and the pointers, they're there until you don't need them anymore. So remember that they're not even sacred in and of themselves. But the reason that you find folks like me out there speaking is that the way that it burst into being, consciousness itself, could have been through the intellect. I find that the West, and particularly the United States, that service and heart are not really as big of an item in terms of how people are as intellect is. I would say what I see out there is a very intellectually driven group of folks. Now, I think it might be nicer if it weren't that way, but I would tell you that when you talk to most people, they're locked in their head. That's where the West and certainly Americans love to live. And then the emotions and all the rest of it get filtered in there. But notice in separation, they always back up the separate ideas. The whole idea of heart is that there's no separation. The whole idea of service is there's no separation. So if you take those two things and you make them separate, you really have moved out of heart and separation anyway. All this is basically dissolving concepts and saying that dissolution will allow you to fall into your heart, fall into service. All of those things happen anyway. It's just how do you get there? And so this is just a particular approach that utilizes that way of getting there. So as you go along, Donna, what you'll find likely, you'll start to gravitate to one or the other. So I was with Osho, and Osho clearly was somebody who held them all. He liked all of those traditions. They were all in the ashram. He saw himself as a place where you could go to the buffet and pick out, the thing you needed, and you could use it in, how and when you needed it. When I ran into Ramesh, all of a sudden that exploded the world. And it was just really clear that was what was just most resonant and tuned in to how things worked over here. And so it was a very easy place for me to fall into. So you could kind of go, well, it's clear where he belongs. He doesn't belong in the service. If he's going to do what he does, it's not going to be the Ram Dass. It's not going to be the Yamachi. It's going to be the Nisargadatta, Ramesh, Ramana Maharshi kind of way. That was just because that's how this one over here is built. So as you go along, Donovan, just watch. There's a high likelihood that you'll start to lean into some things and other things won't arise as much, and that's okay too. That doesn't mean you're falling into a path. It just means you're starting to find the piece of the buffet. If you like chocolate more than vanilla, you go back for more chocolate. That's all that's happening. No big deal. It's just that a lot of times one path or one person or one way will start to speak to you in a more strong way than something else does. And so you just let yourself fall into that particular place. And that's the path thing. And so that answers, do you think there's a downfall to looking in too many places? And I don't at all. I think the spiritual path is a buffet, and you should try the buffet until you find the place that works for you. And I mean, I don't know if you know this, Donovan, but I started out when I started my seeking. Well, I was a Mormon missionary when I was 19 and a philosophy student. And then when it really got heated in my 30s, I was at the metaphysical bookstore. I did the Course on Miracles. In fact, was in a group at the Church of Religious Science in Huntington Beach that we met every week. And then I went on and I did the landmark work, which is, I forget his name. Yeah, I'll think of it in a minute. But and then I did. I can almost tell you. I think I did probably some of everything there was, because then I found Buddha, and then I found the Eastern guys, and then I found. And so my world was one of just simply grabbing onto these as I found them and digesting them and find out how they fit with me and what made sense to me. So I highly recommend that, you know, you reach out there and you take a look, and you'll find, as I say, I spoke about the Enlightenment Intensive, which is something that Satyan runs, but it was also done in Osho's ashram. And it's a process of what we call inquiry, where you're asking in the Ramana Maharshi style, who am I? And then going inside to find out that the you that you think you are doesn't live anywhere in there. It's best. That's my explanation. Much more earth-shaking than that, but that's a description of it. And I would tell you that that process had one of the most immense effects. It was the first thing they had you do when you showed up in Osho's ashram. So that was an amazing, incredibly impactful thing that happened along the way. So from there, I went to a whole bunch of other things before I actually came back. And you can see that Enlightenment Intensive concept lives square in the middle of the work that you're hearing me work with here. So there really isn't a problem from my perspective of trying out all of the candies in the candy store and then finding out which one of those is the one that you lean into. And I don't know, maybe you lean into a lot of them. The stories that you hear me tell a lot of times are things that happen way before I could tell a story and hook it into what I'm talking about. So the Buddha story I told today, I learned with Osho. And so, I tell stories from my early childhood and then hook them into what that has to do as a pointer today. I could have never done that when those stories occurred. So that's a natural thing, is to pull everything out of your own life and your own experience and then relocate it as your own perception shifts. And it's something I highly recommend. Go back to your old stories, play with them, dig into them, see how they want to tell themselves. It's amazing to me, you can actually retell yourself or rethink your own stories and find things in there you never saw before. And you live them. You live the dang experience. And yet you go back and go, wait a minute, that was there all along. And at the time I probably experienced it, but it wasn't ever important until all of a sudden, wow, I think maybe the central point of it is this piece that I just figured out now. And that happens a lot. So I think, I think it's just the mind comes in and it says, you really need to make sure that your seeking is effective and that your seeking is having the results that it needs to have. And then you ask a question, well, should I be on one path? What's a guru? Those questions come from that insecurity of, holy cow, I need to be, I can feel inside I'm really motivated to do this, and I sure as heck don't want to do it wrong. So that's the mind. The mind is it's doing that because in the end it wants you to believe that it's the one in charge. So of course it's also the one in charge of screwing with you. So the minute you step off the path, the mind is there. Well, how can you be enlightened and still function in real life? And you're like, well, that's not an issue. So then you need to find a way to explain why it's not an issue, right? Because that damn mind keeps asking for answers to its questions. So I always like to tell this one particular story, and that is, Osho would say, this is what seeking is like. You pull yourself up to the edge of a bottomless chasm. And because you've tried everything else there is to do in life, you look at that bottomless chasm and you say, what the hell? I've tried everything else. And so you take a jump. Now, as you are hurtling through the air at inestimable speeds into a bottomless chasm, Osho then says, so what should you do? And here's the answer. As you pass each other, just look each other lovingly in the eyes and say, so far, so good. That's what you do. That's what seeking is. Now, the mind, you can see, has no answer to that story. Because when you're hurtling through a bottomless chasm, it's hard to figure out what the point of the exercise is anyway. So I guess so far, so good. It's as good as anything you can say. So now we have the mind is out of the flow, right? So far, so good. And when your mind chatters at you, Donovan, just go back in there and say, hey, wait a minute, sit on the bench. So far, so good. When I need you, I'll call you. So that's how that particular piece works. So, all right, another question, if it applies. One last Donovan question. I want you to, because it's a fun one. And you have the word, it looks like conciseness, but I know it's consciousness. He says, when you use consciousness and awareness, does that match up with the Gita use of Purusha and Prakriti? And yes, it does, but let me explain it in English. And this is simply done as a way to understand the difference between consciousness and awareness, because there are basically, in the story that we tell about consciousness, remember, the experience of consciousness has none of these divisions in it, right? Think about how things happen for you right now. They happen, and then I ask you, how did they happen? And that's when you make up the story about how they happened, because you didn't feel any divisions or anything. You just lived your life in the moment, right? The email comes over, you look at the email, you answer the email, and then I say, why did you answer the email? And you tell me some story about it, about how something caused something, caused something, caused something. But if you actually remember how you did it, there was no cause in there. You know, the email was there, you popped it down, hit reply, and started writing. Nothing caused anything. In the experience itself, there was nothing in there. There were none of these divisions. But when you tell the story about what consciousness is, you make these divisions. So let me tell you, this is the story of consciousness. There are two principles that are always in play, and that is consciousness at rest and consciousness in motion. That's what we call it a lot of times in the West. In order to make that clearer, a lot of teachers, Nisargadatta is one principally that did this to try to help you get the difference, is that he would call one of those awareness. And that's the principle at rest. And then he would say consciousness is everything that involves changeability, motion, or activity. That's consciousness in activity. And so he would divide it up that particular way. And then he would say, what you are is consciousness itself. In the Upanishads, there's a very famous statement that says, the spider spins its web and then pulls it back again. So imagine the entirety of manifestation, everything that's out there, the perceiving that we're doing is simply the web of awareness that has been spit out there, and it actually becomes consciousness in activity or consciousness in motion. So when we talk about consciousness, that's what we talk about. Now, a lot of the times people will talk about consciousness being real and not real. And in the American Western sense of things, when something is real, that's real, right? We know that's real. That's what you and I would call real. I'm beating my iPhone on the desk, by the way. This is all for you guys. And so that's real, and that's how we hold it. In the conception of the East, where we get a lot of our spiritual doctrine, something that is real is something that is always and forever, always was, always will be. And there's only one thing that's real, and that's awareness, right? So that's awareness at rest. Now, before consciousness is created, awareness doesn't even witness anything. There's nothing to witness, right? So Nisargadatta would call that awareness unaware of itself, because it's only when you spin the web that awareness has something to look at, which is consciousness. And so the reason we talk about consciousness a lot is that you can tell we as body minds, we as intellects, we as a story, that's all in motion. That's all happening, right? So that all lives in consciousness. When we talk about witnessing, right, all that is watching what arises, and then the non-active principle is involved by witnessing what arises. But actually, in its pure state, all there is absolute awareness or absolute subjectivity or absolute objectivity. There's no objects or subjects. There's just awareness itself. And so I want you to know all of that I just said. That's the story that is told. And I find it to be, for a lot of folks in the West, the most impenetrable story ever told. It just is really an odd way to think about the world when you come out of a Western tradition with, gods and commandments and becoming perfect and going to the next life if you live well or not, or if it's grace, there's all of these things that describe our journey. Very few of them use the story of consciousness. The reason we use the story of consciousness, though, is that the story of religion that lives in the West is entirely egoic, right? It's based on you as a separate thing. So when you move into a possibility that you are not a separate thing, then a different story needs to be told. So we've borrowed the story of consciousness from the East. And that's what we're using at this particular point in time. I don't know if that will always be the model. You probably could construct and tell the story in a different way. But ultimately, it's still just the story. It's pointing to the actual perception that shifts once that story has been in some way, shape, or form embraced, and it starts to become how the world is seen. You remember last time I said we are all dimensionless perceivers in a world of dimension. So what we all are is the same perception of everything that arises. But because we have given ourselves the story that we're separate, we believe only we are seeing what's arising in our consciousness, right? The way that someone else would explain it is that consciousness is all there is and is watching all of the arisings through each of the body minds that we are. There's only one watching, and that's a dimension. Consciousness ultimately is dimensionless and is simply watching the arising. So sometimes you'll see me make the funny story. I'll go, oh yeah, you know what's really happening here? I think I told Jaya this last, is that consciousness or God has its hand up our asses and we're just puppets and here's what we're doing. Because I find that is a humorous way to look at what's actually happening in front of us. And so it's a pointer, but it's a humorous one. And then I go on to say, use humor. Use humor a lot, and I'll tell you why. Because when you use humor, and certainly when you're the point of that humor, you have to separate yourself from yourself to make fun of yourself. It's almost by itself, it's a necessity. Notice that when people are really serious about who they are, you make fun of them and they get all pissed off about it because they don't want to leave that place of being serious about who they are, right? But actually we do, because we know that inside of ourselves that there is something left to do. And all we're doing is pointing to that something left. And that something left is just seeing the assumptions that we live unwittingly. And those are a lot of fun to make fun of, right? And further, the whole idea that we are something special, like the whole idea You can talk to Alan and he's going to recite this wonderful corporate resume. Now, you all know me really well. You know, I walk into a room, I knock stuff over, I spill the water. If you know, Satyan and Carolyn invited me to a thing to talk to a few of their people, and I'm not sure the furniture's fixed yet from that experience, you know, because that's how Alan is, right? Alan's not elegant. It's just, you know, and that's the story. And it's lovely just to embrace it and go, that's what's going on over here, because that's how it is, right? So that resume that you read about Alan is a lot more impressive because it's pretending and leaving out a lot of stuff about Alan that if you knew it, you'd find, you know, he breaks furniture, wrecks technology, and spills glasses of water, whatever it is that he has in his hands. And that is how it is. That's no joke. So, but I find that to be an amazing, wonderful way to deal with yourself, because it automatically puts you in a place where you can then say, well, so I see that silly Alan who's not all that elegant. I wonder what assumptions he's living that are equally as dumb. And then you laugh about it, right? Because that's kind of a funny thing to think and a funny way to think it. And so I always say humor is one of the superpowers that is incredibly effective in the spiritual journey. So don't be afraid to use that. I recommend it highly. Actually, I think Dan's on here. Dan Calloway and I are old friends. And I think when Dan and I get together, we probably laugh more about the stories that we tell to each other about ourselves. Because Dan's like that too, you know, he just came up the way Dan came up, and Dan's Dan. And so we have whole sessions where we just giggle about how it is that we motor through life while people think that we're something entirely different. That seems to be one of those conversations that's fun to have. But I think it's really also incredibly enlightening whenever you're telling yourself you're something that you haven't fixed in your mind, you're something different than that, then I think you automatically are telling yourself you have somewhere to go. You know, there's the who you are fully expressed is a different thing than you're experiencing right now, and you're going to let that happen entirely in the way that it needs to happen. So that's the amazing use of humor. So those are Dono's questions, and I'm hoping that those were. I actually found those to be really good questions, Dono. I really appreciate it. He was a little worried that he would control the floor, or whatever he said, take up too much space. I forget what he said, and I told him, I said, please, if you have questions, send them over. My experience of sitting at satsang is that it doesn't matter who asks the question. It really doesn't. Nobody hogs up the room in a satsang. If a question is asked that really doesn't belong here, it's pretty easy to kind of step through that. Although I find that in mine anyway, that's incredibly rare. And the questions that you ask are the same ones that everybody else probably is wrestling with in one way, shape, or form or another. So feel free to ask all of those. So remember, I think in a way what we've done, I started out with separation, and then we talked about some of the traditions and ways that we find our way to non-separation. I even got into the esoteric absolute awareness and consciousness conversation. So we went from a really simple all the way to the end of kind of where the path lives today. And this conversation, our satsang conversation, is expanding where it is that you have to place your living understanding. And that living understanding will shift the perception from your belief that you are a separate thing, a separate autonomous living story looking out on the world, into a place where you recognize that you are consciousness itself, simply looking out through the same eyes. and that's the movement. That is the spiritual journey. So, are there any more questions before I? You notice that this thing lasts about an hour every week, I think, or every other week. That's I don't do that on purpose, by the way. I answer all the questions, and it seems like after an hour, we're towards the finish. But if there's another question, pop it in there. If not, I will say the book that Jaya was talking about is one that's called Pointers of Nisargadatta Maharaj. It was written by Ramesh Balsekar while he was a seeker. I have a PDF of that book. Anybody that wants a copy, all of those who are doing the spiritual MBA have a copy of it if you're in module 2 or further. Anybody else that wants a copy, just let me know. I'll be thrilled to send you the PDF of that book. I will. I don't know if I have your email, Donovan. I'm going to send you that because it's one you want to read. It's on its way to you. But anybody else who wants it, just send me an email, alan.shelton, alan.shelton@gmail, or put it on Facebook. I'm not hard to find. I will send you a PDF of that book. By the way, it is a little more difficult reading, but it's a wonderful book, and it's a great kind of book to read. Don't think that it's one to read end to end. Everybody that I work with, they're always like, I got to get it done by the end of module 2. And I'm like, this is a book that never gets done. Don't worry about it. Just read what you can, and we'll continue on. But it definitely is one you want to read. So highly, highly recommended. All right. I see that we have no more questions, so I'm going to end this session. Thank you all. Thank you, Donna, for the questions. And thank you all for being here with me. I'll be here in 2 weeks again. Send questions. And for those that want to, by the way, there is a UK edition of Satsang. It's at an oddball time. It's on Friday mornings at noon Pacific time, because that's 8 in the evening their time. Why anybody would do this at 8 o'clock on a Friday night, no idea, but that's when they wanted it, so that's when I'm doing it. It's a lot of fun. You'll hear some beautiful accents, and so that's just a lot of fun. So anyway, I'll post it on my Facebook and LinkedIn pages, so you'll all see it there as well. Just so everybody knows, on February 19th, there's a thing called Conscious Uprising. It's a Saturday happening in London. And Satya and Raja, who is on right now, and I will both be, I think we're called headliners or what, I don't know. Anyway, our picture's on the flyer. I know that. So that's pretty neat. So anyway, if you're interested in an experience with a few hundred people that are entrepreneurs and whatever, they will all be at this, and we're going to give the corporate and entrepreneurial world a dose of consciousness speak, which I'm not sure they're entirely prepared for. So let's see what wants to happen that day. So if you want to watch that set of fireworks, that's the 19th. So I love you all. Thank you, everybody, and I'll see you next time. All right, bye.